The room was already full when I arrived. No one noticed. My name was printed on the banner behind the stage, slightly crooked, like it had been added last. I stood near the back, holding the envelope they gave me that morning, the one that confirmed everything I had worked for, promotion. It was supposed to be tonight, but my father's voice had cut through it, calm, final, almost tired. Your promotion party can wait. Your sister's engagement is more important. People nodded like it made sense. Like I did not matter. Like I had always been the one who could wait. I said nothing. I just watched, because something in that room did not feel like celebration. It felt arranged. I have always understood where I stood in the house without needing it explained. It was never said directly. There were no rules written down, no clear lines drawn. But the pattern was consistent enough that I learned it early. Some things belonged to my sister. Attention, decisions, urgency. Other things belonged to me. Responsibility, quiet agreement, space that did not need to be filled. I never questioned it. Mornings began the same way for years. I would wake before anyone else, not because I had to, but because it was easier to move through the house when it was still. The kitchen would be untouched, the air quiet. I would make tea, check my messages, review the tasks waiting for me at work. My job required precision, careful review, long hours that no one monitored but everyone depended on. I preferred it that way. The less visible the work, the fewer interruptions. Results mattered more than presence. Over time, people began to trust me with things that were not simple, accounts that needed attention, processes that required consistency. I did not ask for recognition. I did not expect it. The work itself felt stable in a way nothing else did. At home, that same pattern followed me. If something needed to be handled, it came to me, not formally, just placed within reach. A bill left on the table, a document near my seat, a quiet request from my mother that did not need repeating. Check this when you have time. I always had time. My father relied on that, not in a way that felt warm, but in a way that felt certain. He did not ask if I could do something. He assumed it would be done, and it always was. Our conversations were brief, structured, focused on outcomes. Is it handled? Yes, that was enough. With my sister, it was different. Aisha did not carry the same weight, not because she could not, but because no one expected her to. She moved through the house with ease. Conversations opened around her. Plans adjusted to include her. When she spoke, people listened fully, not because she demanded it, but because it came naturally to her. I never resented that. It felt like a balance that had been set long before I noticed it. She was warmth. I was structure. She was expression. I was restraint. There was no conflict in that arrangement, at least not openly. Work became the only place where the pattern shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to feel different. My efforts accumulated there in ways they did not at home. Quiet progress, measurable outcomes. It took years. Long evenings reviewing details no one else wanted to sit with. Early mornings correcting errors that were not mine but became my responsibility. Projects that passed through multiple hands before reaching mine, where they finally settled into something complete. No one announced that I was being considered for promotion. I noticed it through changes in access, new responsibilities, subtle shifts in how decisions moved through me instead of around me. Meetings where my input was no longer optional. I did not speak about it, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had learned that speaking too early changed things. It introduced attention. Expectations, questions I did not want to answer, so I waited. The confirmation came without ceremony, a formal email, a scheduled meeting, a document placed in front of me with clear terms and a timeline that had already been approved. My role would change, my authority would expand. My work would no longer remain in the background. I read it carefully, not for validation, for accuracy. When I left the office that day, nothing felt different externally. The same road home. The same evening light settling across familiar streets. But internally, something had shifted in a way I did not fully examine. I carried the document with me, not to show immediately, just to hold on to it for a while. At home, the atmosphere was already in motion. My mother was on the phone, her tone more animated than usual. There were names I did not recognize, dates mentioned without context. My father was reviewing something at the table, papers spread out in a way that suggested ongoing decisions. I placed my bag down quietly. No one asked about my day. I did not offer it. After some time, I took the document out and set it near my father's papers. Not directly in front of him, just within reach. Visible enough to be noticed when he had time. He glanced at it eventually. Not immediately. Not with urgency. He picked it up, read the first page, then the second. His expression did not change. There was no pause, no shift in posture. He placed it back down, a small nod. "This is good," he said. Then, almost in the same breath, he added, "We need to talk about your sister." The conversation moved without transition. He explained the engagement, the family, the expectations, the timeline that had already been discussed and agreed upon. Dates were fixed. Arrangements were underway. There was an assumption built into every sentence that this would take priority. That it already had. I listened, not because I agreed fully, but because I understood the structure of these moments. Some things were not presented as choices. They were presented as decisions that required alignment. "Your promotion party can wait," he said finally, his tone steady, without emphasis. "Your sister's engagement is more important." There was no room left in the conversation after that. I looked at the document still resting on the table, untouched since he set it down. Then I nodded. "Okay," I said, and the matter was settled. At least that was how it appeared. The house did not become louder after that conversation. It became organized. That was the first change I noticed. Not celebration, not excitement, just structure shifting to accommodate something that had already been decided. Lists began to appear in visible places, names written down, dates underlined, phone calls scheduled at specific times instead of happening casually throughout the day. My mother moved through the house with a kind of focused urgency I had not seen before. Not stressed, just precise. Every conversation had a purpose. Every detail was noted somewhere. My father adjusted his routine without explanation. He began taking calls outside, stepping into the courtyard or onto the balcony, lowering his voice in a way that made the conversations feel contained. When he returned, he did not summarize anything. He simply continued with whatever was next. I did not ask. That was not unusual. What felt different was how consistently things stopped when I entered a room. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A conversation would pause mid-sentence. A name would be replaced with something general. Papers would be shifted, not hidden, but rearranged just enough to change what was visible. No one acknowledged the interruption. They would continue speaking, but the tone would shift slightly. Less specific, more controlled. It happened often enough that it stopped feeling accidental. One afternoon, I walked into the dining area while my parents were reviewing documents. My father had several pages spread out in front of him, numbers written in columns, annotations in the margins. He did not move them away, but he placed his hand over a section as he looked up at me. "Do you need something?" he asked. It was a simple question, neutral, but it redirected the moment entirely. "No," I said. He nodded once, then continued writing. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, then left. Later that evening, I returned to the same table. The documents were still there, but arranged differently. The page I had briefly seen was no longer visible. I did not search for it, but I remembered the format, the structure. It resembled financial planning, not event coordination. I told myself it was related to the engagement. That would make sense. Large events required organization. Budgets, allocations. Still, something about the way it had been handled did not align with that explanation. It felt contained, deliberately so. Aisha's behavior shifted too, though more subtly. She was still present in conversations, still included in decisions, but there was a layer of distance I had not seen before. Not avoidance exactly. She did not leave when I entered a room, but she spoke less directly to me. When our paths crossed, her responses were brief, measured. As if she was choosing her words more carefully than usual. I noticed it most during small moments. I asked her once about the engagement date, just to confirm what I had heard. She paused before answering, not long enough to seem obvious, just long enough to feel intentional. "It's still being finalized," she said. Her tone was calm, but the answer did not match what my father had already described as decided. I did not challenge it. I just nodded. "Let me know when it's confirmed," I said. She agreed, but her eyes moved away before the sentence ended. That was new. A few days later, I found my promotion letter on the dining table again. I had left it in my room. I was certain of that. The folder it was in had been opened. Not carelessly, there were no creases, no signs of mishandling, but the pages were not aligned the way I kept them. Someone had read it, or at least reviewed it. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. No one mentioned it, not that day, not the next. It remained present but unspoken, as if it existed outside the current priorities. I returned it to my room without comment. That evening, my father mentioned scheduling, not my promotion, not even directly related to the engagement, just dates. "We may need to adjust some things next week," he said. "There are overlapping commitments." I knew what he meant, but he did not say it. My promotion date, the formal acknowledgment at work, the internal transition that required my presence. It overlapped with the engagement preparations. "I can manage both," I said. It was a simple statement, practical. He shook his head slightly. "No need to complicate things," he replied. "Focus on what matters right now." Focus on what matters. The phrase stayed with me longer than it should have, not because of what it said, but because of what it excluded. I did not respond. There was no clear argument to make. Everything he said could be justified. Family events took priority. Timelines sometimes conflicted. Adjustments were normal. Individually, each point made sense. Together, they formed something less clear. A pattern I could not fully define yet, but could not ignore either. That night, I reviewed my work schedule again. Then I looked at the engagement timeline as I understood it. Dates, deadlines, commitments. They intersected too precisely. Not loosely, not approximately, exactly. As if they had been aligned intentionally. I sat with that thought for a while. Then I set it aside, because it required an assumption I was not ready to make, that this overlap was not accidental, that it had been planned, and that I had been expected not to notice, at least not immediately. The first time I allowed myself to look closely, I did not call it suspicion. I called it verification. There was a difference, at least in the way I approached it. Suspicion carried emotion. It assumed intent. Verification was quieter. It only required attention. I waited until the house settled into its usual evening rhythm. My mother in her room, speaking softly on the phone. Aisha occupied with messages, her door half closed. My father moving between spaces, finishing conversations that extended beyond the day. I sat at the dining table where the documents had been earlier. They were not there anymore. That was expected. What remained was the familiarity of the surface, the slight indentation where papers had rested. The pen my father preferred, placed exactly parallel to the edge. Nothing looked out of place, which made the absence more noticeable. I did not search the house. Instead, I went to where information was less physical, my laptop. The systems I worked with daily did not feel separate from me. Accessing financial structures, reviewing accounts, tracing transactions, these were not unusual actions. They were part of my routine, controlled, documented, transparent. At least they were supposed to be. I logged in using my credentials, the same ones I had used for years. Secure, regularly updated, monitored through internal protocols I understood well. I did not enter anything unusual. I simply reviewed. The first set of accounts showed nothing unexpected. Regular activity, predictable flows, household expenses aligned with what I had seen over time. Then I moved to linked structures, joint holdings, family-associated accounts that required higher-level authorization. That was where the pattern shifted. At first, it was subtle. A transfer slightly larger than typical monthly movement, not excessive, just elevated, then another, different date, similar structure. I did not react immediately. I noted the timestamps, cross-referenced them with known events. Then I saw the sequence, multiple transfers within a compressed time frame, all occurring within the same week my promotion had been confirmed. The alignment was exact, not approximate. Exact. I leaned back slightly, not out of shock, but to create distance between observation and conclusion. There were explanations. There were always explanations. Family events required funding. Engagements involved expenses that could exceed normal patterns. Allocations could be redistributed temporarily. None of that was unusual. What was unusual was the authorization layer. I opened the transaction details. Each entry carried a record of approval, a digital signature. Credentials used to validate the movement. My credentials, I read it again, not because I doubted what I saw, but because I needed to confirm the structure had not been misinterpreted. User ID, authorization level, timestamp, all aligned with me. I checked my own activity logs where I had been during those times, work schedules, system access records. There were moments where I had not even been online, not at home, not connected to any network that would allow secure access. Yet the approvals were marked as completed, successfully, without flags. I did not feel immediate anger. That would have been easier. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, something internal adjusting to new information without fully processing it yet. I moved through the records again, slower this time, looking for inconsistencies, errors, anything that would suggest a technical fault. There were none. The system had functioned exactly as designed, which meant the input had been accepted as valid. I closed the laptop, not abruptly, carefully, as if the action itself required precision. The room remained unchanged, silent, ordered. Nothing in the physical space reflected what I had just seen, which made it easier to question it, to consider the possibility that context was missing, that there were layers I had not been included in. I stood up and walked to my father's study. The door was slightly open. He was inside, reviewing something on his phone. He looked up when I entered. "Do you need something?" he asked. The same tone as before, neutral, controlled. I held his gaze for a moment, then I asked. There were some recent transfers, larger than usual. I wanted to understand how they're structured. I did not mention my credentials. Not yet. He smiled faintly, not dismissive, not welcoming, just measured. "You worry too much about details," he said. "These things are being handled." "I understand," I replied. "I just need clarity on the authorization process." His expression did not change. "Family matters don't always need formal clarity," he said. "You're used to systems that require it. This is different." Different. The word settled between us, not as an explanation, as a boundary. I nodded once, not because I agreed, but because the conversation had reached its limit. As I turned to leave, he added, "Focus on what's in front of you. Not everything needs your attention." I did not respond. I returned to my room and sat in the same chair where I had reviewed the records. The information had not changed. Only its weight had. Because now it was no longer just data. It was a question, not of accuracy, but of intent. And that was something I could no longer set aside. I did not bring it up again the next day, not because I had resolved anything, but because I needed to observe without interruption. One conversation had already shown me the boundary. Pushing again without clarity would only narrow it further, so I waited. The house continued to function with the same structured urgency. Calls, lists, quiet movements between rooms, nothing outwardly changed, which made it easier for everyone else to move forward as if nothing required explanation. I adjusted my approach. Instead of asking directly, I referenced details indirectly. Small mentions, neutral phrasing, enough to see how information was handled when it surfaced. At breakfast, I said, "There are a lot of financial adjustments happening this week." My father did not look up immediately. He finished reading the line in front of him, then folded the paper with deliberate care. "That's normal before events," he said. My mother nodded in agreement, adding, "These things always look more complicated than they are." I let a few seconds pass. "Some of the authorizations seem to be routed through my access," I said. The sentence was calm, measured, not accusatory. Just precise. My father finally looked at me, not sharply, not defensively, just directly. "You've always had access to these systems," he replied. "It's natural your credentials are part of the process." "That would require my approval," I said. "You're overthinking it," my mother said quickly before he could respond. "Your father handles these matters. You don't need to involve yourself in every detail." I noticed how the response shifted. Not denial, redirection. I held my position. "I'm not trying to involve myself," I said. "I just need to understand how approvals are being processed." My father leaned back slightly in his chair. "There are multiple ways to manage authorizations," he said. "Not all of them require direct action every time." "That's not how the system works," I replied. The silence that followed was brief, but complete. Aisha was sitting across from me. She had not spoken yet. Her attention remained on her plate, though she had stopped eating. My father's expression changed, not in a visible way, but in something more contained. "You're applying professional rules to a personal situation," he said. "That's your mistake." It was subtle, but it reframed everything. The issue was no longer the transactions. It was my interpretation, my approach. "You've always been like this," my mother added softly. "You see things in rigid ways. Not everything needs to be analyzed." Rigid. The word settled differently than I expected. Not because it was harsh, but because it was familiar. It had been used before in smaller contexts, less significant moments. A pattern of describing me in a way that made questioning seem like a flaw rather than a response. "I'm just asking for clarity," I said. "And we're telling you there's nothing to worry about," my father replied. The conversation closed there, not abruptly, just completely. There was no space left to continue without repeating the same points, so I stopped, not because I was convinced, but because I understood the structure of what was happening. Every question I raised was being repositioned, not answered, repositioned. Later that day, my mother approached me while I was reviewing my work. "You've been under a lot of pressure," she said. "This promotion, it's a big step." I looked up. Her tone was gentle, concerned. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she continued. "Sometimes it's okay to trust that others are handling things." It sounded supportive, but the timing was precise. It linked my concern to stress, to overextension, not to the information itself. "I'm managing my work," I said. "I know," she replied. "But stress shows in different ways." Different ways. Again, the implication shifted, not that something was wrong externally, but that something was off internally, that my perception was influenced, distorted. I did not argue. There was nothing direct to counter. That evening, Aisha came to my room. She stood near the door, not fully entering. Everything is just complicated right now, she said. I waited. She did not elaborate. If something feels unclear, she added, it's probably just because there are a lot of moving parts. Her words were careful, neutral, but they aligned with the same pattern, complexity as explanation, not as detail. Do you understand what's happening? I asked. She hesitated, then shook her head slightly. Not fully, she said, but I trust that it's being handled. Trust. The word was placed deliberately. I nodded, not in agreement, just acknowledgment. After she left, I sat in the quiet for a long time, replaying the conversations, not for what was said, but for what remained consistent. No one denied the transactions directly. No one explained the authorization process. Every response redirected the focus, to stress, to personality, to context, to trust. It was precise, too precise to be unintentional. I opened my laptop again, not to recheck the same records, but to begin something different. Documentation, copies of transaction logs, access timestamps, system-generated reports, not because I intended to confront anyone immediately, but because I understood something clearly now. This was no longer a misunderstanding that could be resolved through conversation. It was a structure, and structures did not respond to emotion. They responded to records, so I began collecting them, quietly, without announcement. Because if everything I was being told was accurate, then the records would confirm it. And if they did not, then I would already have what I needed. The confirmation did not come from inside the house. It came from a system that did not adjust itself to protect anyone. I was at work when the message appeared. Not urgent in tone, not marked as priority, just a routine verification request routed through internal channels I had interacted with many times before. A colleague from the bank's compliance division had flagged a set of transactions for confirmation. My name was attached. That alone was not unusual. My access level meant I was often included in reviews, especially when high-value movements required layered authorization. What was unusual was the phrasing. Please confirm that the following transactions were authorized directly by you. No assumption. No pre-filled confirmation, just a request. I opened the attached file. The structure was familiar. Clean formatting. Transaction IDs aligned in sequence. Dates, times, account references, all presented without interpretation. I read through the first entry, then the second, then the third. Each one carried the same signature. Mine, not visually, systematically. Credentials used, authorization confirmed. Execution completed. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I checked the originating access logs included in the report, IP addresses, network identifiers, session timestamps. All traced back to a location I recognized. Home, not a general region. The exact network signature assigned to our house. I sat still for a moment, not reacting outwardly. Around me, the office moved as it always did. Conversations at low volume. Keyboards in steady rhythm, the normal continuity of a place that did not know what I was looking at. I cross-referenced the timestamps with my own activity logs, work login records, building entry data, security badge usage. There were overlaps that could not be reconciled, moments where I had been physically present at work while the system recorded my credentials being used from home. There was no technical ambiguity. No margin for misinterpretation. The system had not failed. It had recorded exactly what it was designed to record. I closed the file, then reopened it, not because I doubted it, because repetition sometimes revealed details the first pass did not. There were notes attached to certain transactions. Vendor names, advance payments, deposits structured in stages, all aligned with the engagement preparations. Venue, catering, logistics. The scale matched what I had observed at home, but the pathway did not. These were not general family expenses. They were being processed through channels that required formal authorization. My authorization, without my input, I responded to the compliance request with a single line. Review in progress will confirm shortly. It bought time, not much, but enough. The next step was not confrontation. It was confirmation. I requested extended logs, not informally, through the proper system, audit trail expansion, session-level details, device identification. The request itself triggered a secondary review. I knew that. That was part of the design. Sensitive access patterns did not remain isolated once examined closely. They expanded. I received the additional data within the hour. Device identifiers matched equipment within our home network. Not specific enough to isolate a single device, but precise enough to confirm origin. Session durations varied, some brief, some extended, all authenticated successfully. No failed attempts, no alerts triggered at the time of access, which meant whoever had used my credentials did so correctly, with full accuracy. I leaned back in my chair, not to distance myself from the screen, but to create space for the realization to settle without interruption. This was not accidental access. Not a one-time oversight. It was repeated, structured, executed with consistency. I printed the records, not because digital copies were insufficient, but because physical documents carried a different weight. They existed outside the system, unaffected by edits, unaffected by access. I placed them in a folder and closed it. The action felt final in a way I had not expected, as if moving from observation to acknowledgment. When I returned home that evening, the house was already active. Voices filled the main room. Relatives had begun arriving earlier than planned. Laughter moved easily through the space. Conversations layered over each other. Everything appeared exactly as it should. A family preparing for an engagement. My father stood near the entrance, greeting people as they arrived, composed, confident, his posture unchanged. If there was pressure, it did not show. My mother moved between guests, ensuring everyone was attended to. Aisha sat among a group of relatives, her expression calm, engaged, present. No one looked unsettled. No one appeared uncertain. I stood near the edge of the room for a moment, observing, not participating, just watching, because the contrast was too precise to ignore. Inside the folder in my hand were records of something that should have disrupted this entire scene, but nothing here reflected that. The system had recorded everything. The house had acknowledged nothing. I moved through the space without drawing attention, placed the folder in my room, returned to the main area, listened to conversations that did not include me, watched interactions that did not require me. Everything functioned, smoothly, seamlessly, as if the underlying structure supporting it had not been altered. And that was when the understanding settled fully. This was not hidden in the sense of being unknown. It was hidden in the sense of being unspoken, maintained through silence, sustained through assumption. No one needed to deny anything, because nothing had been directly stated. I remained there for a while longer, long enough to confirm that nothing would surface on its own. Then I stepped back, not physically, internally, because I no longer needed more indication. I had records, I had system confirmation, I had alignment between transactions and events. What I did not have was acknowledgment, and that absence was not accidental, it was chosen. I did not confront anyone that night. The house was too full, the atmosphere too carefully maintained. Any disruption would not reveal anything new, it would only shift attention. So I waited, not passively, deliberately. The next morning, I initiated the process formally, not through conversation, through the system. I submitted a request for transaction clarification under internal compliance protocols. It was not an accusation. It did not assign blame. It simply marked the activity for structured review. That distinction mattered. Because once a process entered the system at that level, it no longer depended on personal interpretation. It followed procedure, automatically. The request triggered an internal audit flag. I knew it would. I also knew that once triggered, it would extend beyond a single set of transactions. Patterns would be analyzed. Historical data would be reviewed. Access consistency would be measured against standard behavior. The system did not assume intent. It only tracked deviation. By midday, I received confirmation that the review had been escalated. No alarm, no urgency, just a notification. Extended verification initiated. I continued my work as usual. No visible change, no indication that anything had shifted. But internally, the process had already begun moving in a direction that could not be easily redirected. When I returned home that evening, the difference was subtle. Not visible to anyone unfamiliar with the house, but clear to me. My father's calls were longer, not louder, just extended. He remained outside for most of them, pacing slowly, speaking in a lower tone than before. When he re-entered, he carried the same composed expression, but the transitions between actions were less fluid. A slight delay before responding, a pause before sitting. My mother moved with the same precision as before, but her focus shifted more frequently. Tasks were started, then revisited. Conversations repeated in shorter intervals. Aisha stayed mostly in her room. The door closed now, not half open, not casually, fully closed. No one mentioned the system, not directly, but adjustments had already begun. At dinner, my father spoke about timelines again. Some payments are being delayed, he said, his tone neutral. Vendors are asking for reconfirmation. My mother nodded as if this was expected. These things happen, she said. It's just part of the process. Process. The word was used differently now. Not as something internal, as something external, something that required response. I listened without interrupting. My father glanced at me briefly, not long enough to hold eye contact, just enough to register presence. "You've been in touch with your office about next week?" he asked. The question was indirect, but the reference was clear. "Yes," I said, "everything is scheduled." He nodded once. "Good," he replied, no further detail, no clarification, but the question itself was not casual. It was a measure, an attempt to understand how much I had engaged with the system beyond the initial review. That night, I received a formal request from compliance. A statement was required, not optional, a documented confirmation of whether I had authorized the transactions in question. The language was precise, binary, yes or no, no space for interpretation. I read it carefully, not because the answer was unclear, but because the consequences of each response were. A yes would validate the transactions retroactively. The review would close, no further action. A no would escalate the matter, trigger deeper investigation. Potential legal involvement. The system did not assign emotion to either option, but the outcomes were not neutral. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I saved the request, closed the file, and waited. The next morning, my father approached me before I left for work. "We need to keep things stable this week," he said. His tone was calm. Measured, but there was a layer beneath it that had not been present before. "Stability matters right now." I looked at him. He held my gaze longer than usual. "If there are any unnecessary complications," he continued, "it could affect more than just timing." More than timing, he did not specify what. He did not need to. "I understand," I said. He nodded. The conversation ended there. At work, the environment remained unchanged, which made it easier to focus. I reviewed the compliance request again, opened the transaction logs, compared them once more against my activity records. Nothing had shifted. No new information had emerged, only the pressure to respond. By midday, a follow-up message arrived. Reminder, statement required within 48 hours. The timeline was fixed, not flexible. The system would proceed regardless. I printed the request, placed it with the other documents. Then I sat back and considered the structure of everything in front of me. At home, silence maintained continuity. At work, documentation required resolution. Two systems, both operating correctly but moving in different directions. That evening, the house was quieter, not empty, just reduced. Fewer calls, shorter conversations. My mother asked me if I had eaten. Aisha remained in her room. My father reviewed papers at the table. The same table where my promotion letter had once been placed and set aside, now covered with documents that required immediate attention. He did not look up when I entered, but he spoke. "Have you resolved the issue from your office?" The phrasing was deliberate. The issue, not the transactions, not the authorization, just the issue. "I've received the request," I said, "and," he asked, "I'm reviewing it." He placed his pen down, slowly, then looked at me. "This is not something that needs to be complicated," he said. The sentence was calm but final, as if the complexity itself was a choice, and that I was responsible for it. I did not respond, because the system had already defined the options, and none of them were simple. The document was placed in front of me without ceremony. No explanation, no introduction, just paper meeting the surface of the table with a soft, controlled finality. It was early evening. The house was quieter than it had been in days. No guests, no overlapping conversations, just a stillness that felt intentional, as if space had been cleared for something specific. My father remained standing for a moment after placing it down. Then he sat across from me. My mother stood near the doorway, not entering fully. Present, but not part of the table. Aisha was there too, seated to the side, her posture composed, her hands resting in her lap. No one spoke immediately. I looked at the document. It was not from the bank, not formally, but it referenced the same transactions. A summary, simplified, condensed into a single page that removed all technical language and left only the conclusion it wanted me to accept. A statement of retroactive approval, a space for my signature, nothing else. No mention of investigation, no reference to compliance, just confirmation. I read it once, then again, carefully. The wording was deliberate. By signing, I would be acknowledging that the transactions had been authorized with my consent. Not implied, not assumed, confirmed. I placed the paper back on the table. My father watched me, his expression steady. "This is just procedure," he said, the same tone he used for routine matters, controlled, neutral. "If you sign it, everything stays as it is." Everything. The word held more weight than the sentence suggested. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I looked at the edges of the document. The margins, the alignment, small details that did not matter but gave me time to think without appearing hesitant. My mother spoke next. "There's no need to create unnecessary complications," she said softly. "The engagement is already under pressure." Under pressure, not at risk, not uncertain, just under pressure, as if the outcome was still intact, only strained. I shifted my gaze to Aisha. She had not spoken, not once. Her eyes remained lowered, focused somewhere on the table but not on the document itself. Her stillness was precise, not emotional, not reactive, contained. "Do you understand what this is?" I asked. The question was directed at no one in particular, but the room received it. My father answered. "It's a resolution," he said. "A way to close something that does not need to remain open." Close, resolve, words that suggested completion, not examination. I nodded slightly. Then asked, "And if I don't sign it?" The silence that followed was longer this time, not because the answer was unknown, but because it required acknowledgment. My father leaned back slightly. His posture did not change dramatically, but the distance between us increased. "Then the process continues," he said, "and that process involves people who are not concerned with context." Context. The same word he had used before, now positioned as something that could be lost. My mother stepped closer. "Sometimes it's better to protect what we can," she said. "Not everything needs to be exposed." Protect, expose. The language shifted again, not denial. Not explanation, just reframing. I looked at the document once more, then at the pen placed beside it. It was the same pen my father used for his own signatures. Familiar. Consistent. Ready, I picked it up. Not to sign, just to feel its weight. It was heavier than I expected, or maybe I was more aware of it. I held it there for a moment, then set it back down, gently. "I can't confirm something that isn't accurate," I said. My voice was calm, no emphasis, no resistance in tone, just a statement. My father's expression did not change, but something behind it settled, not surprise, recognition. My mother exhaled slowly. Aisha remained still. The moment did not escalate. No one raised their voice, no one argued, which made the shift more permanent, because there was no reaction to reverse. Only acceptance of what had just been established. "This will complicate things," my father said. "Yes," I replied. There was nothing else to add. The system had already defined what came next. This was not a negotiation, not a misunderstanding, just a point where two directions separated. One maintained everything as it appeared. The other allowed everything to be examined. I stood up, not abruptly, just enough to signal that the conversation was complete. No one stopped me. No one asked me to reconsider, because the choice had already been made, not in that moment, but in everything that had led to it. As I walked back to my room, I felt the shift fully, not as relief, not as tension, just clarity. There was no version of this where everything remained the same, only versions where it was either hidden or recorded, and I had chosen, without raising my voice, without making a scene, without needing anyone to agree. I had chosen the version that did not depend on belief, only on what could be verified, and that was enough. The system did not respond immediately. It never did. There was no instant reaction to my decision, no alert that marked the moment as significant. The request remained open for the rest of the evening, unchanged, as if nothing had shifted. But by the next morning, the structure had already begun adjusting. I received a formal acknowledgment from compliance. "Statement recorded. Escalation in progress." No tone, no judgment. Just confirmation. From that point, the process moved without requiring further input from me. The review expanded beyond the initial transactions. Linked accounts were flagged. Patterns were mapped across a longer timeline, not just the engagement, everything connected to it. At home, the first visible change came through absence. Calls that had been constant became selective. My father still spoke on the phone, but less frequently and for shorter durations. Conversations that once extended into late hours now ended quickly. Not resolved, concluded. My mother adjusted her movements again. The lists remained, but they were no longer being added to. Instead, items were crossed out, reordered, reconsidered, not with panic, with control. Aisha's engagement preparations did not stop immediately, but they slowed. Vendors began reaching out, not directly to me, through the channels they had been using, requesting confirmation, clarification, reassurance. Payments that had been processed were now under review. Some were delayed, others were paused entirely. No accusations were made. No one called it fraud. They simply asked for verification. And when verification required documentation, the process stalled. My father attempted to maintain continuity. He arranged meetings outside the house, followed up with contacts, provided explanations that did not require documentation. Context, verbal assurance, reputation. For a few days, that was enough. Until it was. The first formal request came from the other family involved in the engagement. Not a confrontation, a message, polite, structured. They requested clarity on the financial arrangements, not the event itself, the structure behind it. My father read it in silence, then set the phone down. He did not respond immediately. My mother asked what it said. He summarized it in fewer words than the message contained. "They want confirmation," he said. Confirmation. The same word that had been placed in front of me, now required from another direction. The difference was this time it could not be resolved through a single signature, because the system had already recorded the absence of one. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Requests increased, not in volume, in precision. Each one focused on a specific element, a transaction, a timeline, an approval. Individually, they were manageable. Together, they formed a structure that required consistency. And consistency required records, which no longer aligned. The engagement was not canceled. There was no formal announcement, no moment where it was declared over. It simply stopped progressing. Dates were no longer discussed. Preparations were no longer updated. The lists on the table remained, but untouched. Relatives began to withdraw, not abruptly. Gradually, fewer calls, shorter visits, conversations that avoided specifics. No one asked direct questions. But the absence of certainty was enough. In the house, the silence changed. It was no longer controlled. It was settled. My father continued his routine, but with less emphasis on outcomes. Tasks were completed, but not extended. Conversations were held, but not pursued. My mother spoke less about the engagement, then not at all. Aisha moved through the space differently, not withdrawn, not expressive, just adjusted. As if recalibrating her place within a structure that no longer supported the same expectations. No one mentioned the transactions again, not directly. They did not need to. The process outside the house continued to document everything. Access logs, authorization records, verification requests. Each one existed independently of what was said inside. And over time, that became the only version that remained consistent. No narrative needed to be maintained. No explanation repeated. Because the records did not change, they did not adapt to protect anyone. They simply remained. And that was enough.